Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to Tampa History Center, for braving the rain this evening. My name is Rodney Kite-Powell, and I am the director of the Touchton Map Library here at the History Center, and thrilled that you all could join us here this evening, both in person and those viewing at home, both live and viewing this after the fact, for our first Florida Conversations of the 2021-2022 season. Florida Conversations is a program that we've had now for 15, 16 years, maybe longer. It's something that we do in partnership between the History Center and the USF Libraries, and is also sponsored in part by USF Public Media. So as I said, this is the first of the season, and so just to give you all a taste of what's coming up for the fall, at least, in October, on October 20th, we will have a talk that really is right on the 100th anniversary of the 1921 hurricane. And so that topic is the hurricane of 1921. And that is presented by Dr. Brad Massey, our curator of public history here at the History Center, as well as Greg D., who is a meteorologist here for ABC News. In November, on November 17th, we have another kind of anniversary. We're looking at 50 years since the desegregation of public schools here in Hillsborough County. And that will actually be a panel discussion led by the History Center's Fred Hearns, who is the curator of Black history here at the History Center. And will include Imam Askia Muhammad Akil, formerly known as Oath of Favors, founder of the Black Youth for Peace and Power, and Jeff Amos of the Saturday Morning Breakfast Group. And then in December, we have a interesting talk on Florida's prehistory, and that is titled The 9 Lives of Florida's Famous Key Marco Cat. And that is presented by Austin Bell, who is an author and curator of collections at the Marco Island Historical Society. And the Key Marco Cat, just to give you a little kind of bit of story about that, is there was a very famous archaeological excavation done in the Key Marco area in 1896. And it was a wet site, archaeological site that was submerged in water, and so it actually prohibited any kind of decomposition of wood and fibers. And so there's a lot of wood artifacts that came out of that, including this carved cat, which has been subsequently dubbed the Key Marco cat. And so that is what Austin will be talking about in December. We also have not only do we do things here at the History Center, we also have a location in Hernando County, the Pensegat Manor House in Brooksville. And in October, on October 16th, we have an event called Founders Day, the Founders Day Picnic at Pensegat. And that will be celebrating the founding of Brooksville at Pensegat, our sister site, where we will offer tours of the house, reenactors, music, and food trucks. And for all of these things, just go to our website, which is tampabayhistorycenter.org, and you can learn all about those things. You can also join and donate and do all kinds of other great things that help us do the things that we do here at the History Center. So now that the commercials are over, let's talk history. So we have here at the History Center the Touchton Map Library, and it's, for those of you who have not been, it's on our 4th floor in an area that we actually added onto the building in 2018. And it's yet another place where we can have changing exhibits. And so the current exhibit on display in the map library is entitled Outpost of Statehood, the Florida Territory, dates 1821 to 1845. If you haven't guessed, we like to do things on anniversary dates. So this is the 200th anniversary of the beginning of the Florida Territory, and so that's why we decided to do this exhibition. And so the talk I'm going to do for you today is giving you just a taste of the exhibit. Of course, want you all, those of you who are able to come here and see the exhibit in its entirety. But if you are not able to, this will serve certainly as a taste of it. But also, you can go online on our website, and you can access almost the entire map collection through our website and through a database called Luna. And so if you go to the History Center website, you go to the Touchton Map Library, you can then access almost 6,000 images from the map collection. So you can access all of these that you're seeing here today as well. So let's get started. So this should be familiar to you guys, the map of most of North America, what we would consider the United States today, plus a little bit of Mexico. And this is actually a manuscript map or a hand-drawn map that it's based on a map from 1820 from an atlas, the Morse Atlas. And it shows the manuscript drawing was done in 1821, but it shows basically what the United States looked like when Florida became a U.S. territory. And so it was important for us to really start the exhibit this way and for me to start the talk this way, because I think people kind of lose sight of how small the U.S. was just 200 years ago. Really, it was the first 30 years of our existence. And so the states that make up the United States, of course, are confined to basically the Mississippi River and to the east. There are territories on here. Florida, of course, is a new territory on this map, still divided up between West Florida and East Florida. There's also the Missouri Territory, Michigan Territory, what they call the Northwest Territory, and then the reaches of the Louisiana Purchase kind of going off to the north and the west. And then a considerable amount of the country, as we see it today, is covered by Mexico. And so this is what the U.S. looked like when Florida became a U.S. territory in 1821. So, but other than the idea of celebrating an anniversary, why is it important to even kind of study or learn about Florida's territorial years? And one of the things that I think is really important, or among the things that are very important about studying Florida's territorial time, is you really get a sense for the growth of the country. Florida now is often referred to as a mirror or a reflection on the United States as a whole. And it was back then to some degree. A lot of the issues that were facing the U.S. At the time, politically and socially, and that would be facing the U.S. in the coming years, were occurring in Florida. Florida eventually would be admitted as a slave state to the Union. And that, of course, the expansion of slavery became obviously a very big issue in the United States. But just the very pattern of growth in Florida mirrors the pattern of growth in the U.S., where we have densely populated states in much smaller and territorial size from the east to west, growing kind of larger in scale and more square in shape as you go to the west. Well, the same thing happens in Florida. Even if you look at a map of Florida today, there are lots of small, irregularly shaped counties in the north, the oldest part. And then as you go further south, the counties become larger physically, but also in population, but also more regular in shape because they're following a township system, a township range and section system that makes things square, basically. And so, again, the growth of Florida from north to south mirrors the growth of the U.S. from east to west. Also, the issue of Indian removal. That is something that was an issue in the United States, obviously throughout the country and throughout the country's growth. But the so-called Indian Wars that occurred in the U.S. out west after the Civil War actually occurred here in Florida prior to the Civil War. And in some ways, Florida proved as a training ground for some of the people who become generals in the Civil War and even the Mexican War. And then, of course, we have Native people here living today, the Seminoles and Miccosukes, and they trace, of course, their history through this time period as well. So there's lots of different things that are going on and that were going on in Florida that relate to the larger picture of the U.S. History. So this map is a map from 1822, actually, and it's called the Carey and Lee map. It's Matthew Carey and Isaac Lee created this map. And it's a little unusual from other maps in that it has an incredible amount of information that kind of ring the map. And so it tells you a lot of details about Florida, which is funny because there really weren't a lot of details of Florida to know at the time. Florida was divided still between west and east. Hadn't been named counties yet, but West Florida, highlighted in pink, would become Escambia County. And East Florida, which is the peninsula, would become St. Johns County. And those are divisions that actually started back when Florida was a British territory in the 1760s and 1770s, having this east-west divide. And West Florida at different times went all the way to the Mississippi River. But when it became a territory of the U.S., they maintained those two halves, so to speak, those two sections for a couple years. So actually, there were different capitals of Florida. The capital of West Florida was Pensacola. The capital of East Florida was St. Augustine. And for a few years, the territorial legislature would actually meet in one or the other cities. And they realized that's an insane idea. Why would you want to do that? And so they found the rough midpoint between the two. And actually, I kind of measured on Google, and that really is the midpoint. And that's Tallahassee. And Tallahassee was a American Indian town. Hadn't been settled by Anglos yet, but they created this town to become the capital of Florida because it just made sense as being the midpoint between St. Augustine and Pensacola. People often today look at a map of Florida and say, why is the capital way up there, kind of away from everything else? Because it was really in the middle of everything else back then. This map is actually from a year before. This is William Darbys map of Florida. And it's important because it likely was the first map of the territory of Florida printed when Florida became a territory. It's printed the same year, 1821, that Florida became a territory. And again, you see the separation between West Florida and East Florida, at least the identification of such. And then insets. Sometimes insets will really tell you the important details of a place. And you have three. You have Pensacola, you have St. Augustine, and by some miracle, Tampa Bay. We were an important part of that. We're down the bottom. They didn't orient us the right way, so north is to the left, but we did make the cut. And that's really it's surprising, to be honest with you, because Tampa Bay was not really settled by American settlers at that point, and it would have been more likely to maybe even have Key West as a point of reference, or Cedar Key than us, but we're there. A few years later, after that map, we would become a pretty important place and begin to kind of take our importance as a important city on the west coast of Florida. This map kind of almost would have prevented that from happening if what had been depicted came true. There was a guy named Richard Hackley, and when the news that Florida was going to become a U.S. territory, the U.S. was going to acquire Florida from Spain, Hackley and a lot of other people attempted to get Spanish land grants. So while Spain still owned Florida and the Florida territories, they figured it would be a lot easier to acquire large chunks of land than it would be to go through the homesteading process that the U.S. was beginning to establish to provide land grants. And so Hackley and others used whatever influence they could to have the King of Spain, or his designees, provide them with these big land grants. And so if you look at this is basically kind of central Florida. And you can follow, there's a yellow line that starts up kind of around the Brooksville kind of area, Spring Hill, and goes up, over, and then down the middle of the state and down to the kind of Charlotte Harbor area, Fort Myers area. That was all of Hackley's land grant. It's a tremendous amount of land. And this was, again, prior to Florida becoming officially a U.S. territory. The process for Florida's territorial transition was a long one. It began in 1818 and didn't finish until 1821. So there was a lot of time for these kind of things to happen. Well, when the U.S. takes over Florida, they don't want individuals owning these huge tracts of land. They want to own it, so they can do what they need to do with it. And so, also kind of at the same time, in 1824, the military decides to establish a fort here in Tampa on the shores of Hillsborough Bay. And so it just so happens that Hackley chose Tampa Bay as the center and his kind of homestead for his land grant, even going so far as to build a home basically about where we are, within, probably a 200-yard radius of where we are. But he happened to be away in January of 1824. And it happened to be in January of 1824 that Colonel George Mercer Brooke arrived here to establish what became Fort Brooke. So Brooke shows up and he says, wow, there's already a house. I'll just move right in. And his men clear some land, and they establish this military fort. Well, Hackley comes back, sees the military here, sues the federal government, and the very long protracted case finally resolved for the last time in 1904 in the federal government's favor, because, of course, negotiators for the Adams-O'Neese Treaty, which was the treaty that transitioned Florida from Spain to the U.S., knew about all these land grants, and they'd made it so any land grant that was established after a certain time was null and void, and Hackley's was one of those. So he lost all that property, but didn't stop him from trying to do some things in the middle. So we'll talk about Hackley again in a little while. But let's get back to where things are kind of really happening, which is North Florida, or in this case, West Florida. With the establishment of Tallahassee as the capital, things began to grow in that middle Florida section. Again, middle Florida being kind of the middle part of North Florida. But Pensacola was still a very important city, even more so than St. Augustine. And that's because of its proximity to the other colonies, or the other states to the north, particularly Georgia and Alabama, and the harbor that existed at Pensacola. So it was a pretty important city for Florida and for the Gulf Coast during the 1820s, all the way up really through the 1870s. So Pensacola was a prime and important city, which made West Florida kind of by extension pretty important. You also have, again, with more people moving in, the beginnings of more and more counties. So already there are 6 counties that make up this part of West Florida on John Williams' 1827 map. So growth is beginning to happen. You also have people bringing in enslaved African Americans into this area as well, and really starting to begin a plantation economy similar to what was seen in Georgia, South Carolina, and other places in the South. This map was drawn by a man named Isham Circe, and it was printed in 1829, and it's a wall map. It's actually not much smaller than the screen is projecting it here. It's a very large map, and kind of inherently with these large wall maps, they've become rare over the years. So there's less than 10 copies of the Circe map that's still in existence today. Robert Butler was the main surveyor for Florida. He was the surveyor general for the Florida Territory, even the first few years of Florida statehood. And he only had 2 assistants to really help with all the surveying of the entire territory, which is an incredible amount of land to try and survey. But Isham Circe was one of those 2 deputy surveyors that he had with him. So Circe's map is very accurate, and particularly for the time, because he was getting the field surveyors' information pretty quickly, and he's able to convert that into to his map. You can also see it's a little hard to see on the screen for those here, but maybe for those at home it's a little easier. But you already see the beginnings of the township range and section systems, kind of creating these squares that would allow for homesteading. And that would become very important later in the territorial era and the beginning of statehood. And then lastly, for this map, you have Circe's plan of Tallahassee, which, if you look at it and compare it to the street grid today, is actually still pretty much the same. There are some differences as streets have been closed and buildings built that span multiple blocks. But for the most part, this plan of Tallahassee is about the same today as it was in 1829 as depicted on this map. This is actually a 2-sheet map, published also 1829, but this was published by the federal government. And the map maker here was a guy named William Swift. So Swift was a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And it's interesting, if you look at the class that he was in, I think he was the class of 1922 or 23, somewhere in there. He's listed last, but he's not the last in his class. That's the person last in the class at West Point is always called the GOAT, which is not a good thing. Not like Tom Brady being the GOAT. The GOAT of your class is bad. But he wasn't the GOAT of the class. He was put at the end of that role because he didn't graduate with them. He was actually out west doing surveying work. So basically the work he was doing with what will become the Army Corps of Engineers, but we're just engineers in the Army at the time, satisfied his requirements to graduate from West Point. So that's why he's placed at the bottom of the roll. In the 1820s, he came to Florida because they had the idea, which was not a new idea and was not an idea that ended at that point, to create a canal that would go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico to eliminate the long passage around the Florida Peninsula. And that's why the map not only is very detailed as far as the coastline, but you see all these insets of harbors. Because all of those harbors were either on the Atlantic side or on the Gulf side, and those were the possible points of terminus or beginning points of a potential canal that would cross Florida. Again, I mentioned that this was not the first time that people had this idea. The Spanish thought about this, the English thought about this, and not the last time, the idea of a cross-state barge canal actually survived into the 1960s until the idea was finally killed by President Nixon. But people had been impatient about the size of Florida and the time it took to go around the entire peninsula for a very long time. So Swift's job was to try and find a way through that. Needless to say, it never happened. So this is one of my favorite maps that's in the collection. It too is also very rare. There are very few original copies of this. This is a map of Sanibel Island, spelled with a Y, not an I. And Sanibel Island's on Florida's west coast, just south of Sarasota. And in 1833, the Florida Land Company began selling property on Sanibel Island. And this is a fantastic map. The Florida Land Company had a contract with our friend Richard Hackley, who still claimed to own this part of Florida. And so they wanted to subdivide Sanibel in two different ways. One, if you look all the way on the right-hand side of the map, or I guess it would be the eastern portion of Sanibel, you have the town plots. And actually, whereas there is a town there, including a lighthouse on Sanibel. But then as you go through the majority of the island, you see these long lots that go from, I guess, Pine Island Sound up through the Gulf of Mexico. And those are actually agricultural lots. And there's a lot of writing on this map. And this map, the writing on it, it talks about how fertile the land is on Sanibel. And it's not very fertile now. You can grow hibiscus and things, but you really can't grow a lot of crops on the island as implied by that writing. But there was a hurricane that swept through here in 1835, so just a couple years after this map was made. And the story goes, it washed the topsoil off of Sanibel. So Sanibel may well have actually been a very fertile island for growing fruit and vegetables when this map was drawn. The Sanibel Island development, the Florida Land Company, both folded by the early 1840s, and you really didn't have any new settlement onto Sanibel until the late 19th century, but it really wasn't until a bridge was constructed in the second half of the 20th century that you really had any manner of growth on either Sanibel or Captiva to the north. So this is the Henry Tanner map of the territory of Florida, and this is from 1836. So just a short period of time between 1833 with the Sanibel map and 1836, a lot had happened. And so one thing that happened for us here in Tampa in Hillsborough County is Hillsborough County was created in 1834. And it's, one thing to kind of as a point of pride to think our county is that old, but also was a very large county geographically speaking. It was actually larger than is shown here on this map. It's kind of funny from a kind of map research standpoint. It's really hard to find a map of Florida that shows Hillsborough County at its fullest size. And that's just because map makers really weren't concerned with Hillsborough County at that time. So you have to find these maps that show different colored sections and kind of piece them together to get a sense of the scope of Hillsborough County. So in this case, if you look at the pink part on west coast of Florida, the green part just to the north of that, and then the yellow part to the east. So what would be from Sarasota County north up through probably almost Sumter County, and then of course Pinellas, Hillsborough, Manatee, and going all the way to the east, almost to Orange County. That was all Hillsborough County, plus a little bit more. And the problem with that from a political standpoint is that included land that was promised to the Seminoles and Miccosukes. And by that point, though, the federal government had determined to remove the Seminoles and Miccosukes who'd lived in Florida for generations, remove them from Florida. And so the treaties and broken treaties and the broken promises and everything that the U.S. government had with the Seminoles and Miccosukes pushed them to the point of warfare with the federal government. And that started in December of 1835, so just shortly before this map was published. And that was the start of what we know as the Second Seminole War. Fort Brooke here in Tampa was the headquarters for that war, and it lasted for 7 years, and it was among the costliest Indian wars that the federal government ever fought. Again, kind of a prelude to both the Civil War from a military standpoint, but also to the Indian wars that followed the Civil War out west. I had mentioned the beginning of the Seminole War started in December of 1835. That's when a large group of Seminoles attacked a column of soldiers going from here, Fort Brooke in Tampa, to Fort King up in Ocala. What became known originally as the Dade Massacre, now is known as the Dade Battle. The map makers of the day heard about this, and they heard that a county was going to be formed in honor of Major Francis Dade, and so they figured it's going to be close to where this Dade Battle occurred. So it's hard to tell, but the green section, the green county, basically, just to the north of Tampa Bay, on this map is called Dade County. So they got the map, they got the county location wrong. There actually are several maps that show Dade County in this incorrect location, just because the map makers just guessed where it would be. They never would guess that it would be so far south where nobody lived, at least nobody that they were concerned with lived. They would never have thought about putting a county down there. So that's why they placed Dade County to the north of Tampa Bay, kind of in the Hernando, Pasco Hernando, Sumter area. So mentioning the Seminole Wars, the American military had a very difficult time, certainly early on in the war, actually fighting the war in Florida. Florida is very inhospitable, at least certainly was back then. But also there really wasn't a lot known geographically about the interior of Florida. Most of the cities at that time, and really still to this day, are on or near the coast. And there really wasn't a lot of detail known about the interior. And this map doesn't even have Lake Okeechobee on it. And the thing about this map, which is, I think, pretty cool, is there's this message on the top right, which basically says, this map's being assigned to officers that are in the field in Florida. And as new information comes out, as you basically are going through Florida and you see things that aren't on this map, write them down on this map and send them back to the War Department so they can make better maps. And so, you know, we have crowdsourcing today. This was crowdsourcing in the 1830s. This map was published in 1837. So they had very little idea. There's actually a quote from a General Jessup, who said that in spite of the fact that there is a topical engineering corps and there are surveyors, that they know more about the interior of China in the 1830s than they know about Florida. And that was a situation that they had, is they had a very difficult time knowing really what was in the Florida territory. And the subsequent maps, of course, would change that. I mentioned Fort Brooke here in what is now downtown Tampa. This is a map of that fort. I mentioned a lot of maps being rare. This is another one of those maps that is very rare. The original print is in our collection, actually transferred to us from the Matheson Museum in Gainesville. And this is the only known copy that exists. And it is a very important map of the fort because it shows the fort at its largest, at least as far as we know, at its largest. And this was when Fort Brooke was certainly at its most important, as the U.S. was proceeding with the war of removal with the Seminoles. And so, again, this is from 1838, January 1838. And the map shows where officers' quarters were, enlisted men's quarters were, where the ammunition was held, where prisoners, Seminole prisoners were kept. And it also includes the locations of several cemeteries here on the fort, or on the fort property. And this map, along with others, have been used to identify the locations of those cemeteries here in downtown Tampa. If you were to try and find the History Center on this map, we would be offshore. The property that we're on was dredged at the beginning of the 20th century. So, so actually, we would, I think, just at the very edge of the right-hand side of the map, just offshore. So if you kind of follow the Y and Bay up to the top right a little bit on that offshore area, that's about where we would be today. So even though there was a war being fought in Florida, the government still proceeds to do government things. And so one of the things is establishing post offices and things like that, and postal routes. So that's what this map shows, post offices and postal routes, canals and railroads in Florida. This is 1839. And so So there's really not a lot of those things in Florida. There are a few post offices, particularly in North Florida. No railroads, no canals, and really not much of anything south of, say, Ocala, which would be Fort King, with the exception of the town of Tampa, which was basically attached to Fort Brooke, and of course, Key West. Again, thinking about the size of Hillsborough County at this time, it was if you look at the Tampa Bay area on west central Florida, the pink bit is identified as Hillsborough. The yellow part just south of that, which does not have the word Hillsborough on it, was also part of Hillsborough County. So that's, again, give you a sense of the size of Hillsborough at the time that map was printed in 1839. So a few years later, 1842, the U.S. military had succeeded in removing all but about 800 Seminoles from Florida. They removed them to the Indian Territory out west, what is now Oklahoma. And those Seminoles who they were now able to remove were pushed further and further into the interior of Florida, into the south, into the Everglades. And so it's actually interesting to have a map published in 1842 at the end of the war of South Florida, but that's what this is. There actually aren't a whole lot of maps that focus just on South Florida this early in Florida's history, at least for Florida's American history. You see the words Big Cypress and the Everglades here, because those are, of course, the dominating features. It does identify the names of Seminole and Miccosukee villages, as well as U.S. military forts and the roads on the high ground that connected those different villages. You also see the beginnings of the township system with the grid, but none of this property had been surveyed by Butler and his crews. So this is more of a kind of a wishful thinking grid than really anything else. It would be a long time before the Seminoles who were living here and their descendants would ever really be kind of bothered by Anglos. Actually, not until the creation of the Tamiami Trail, the road that connects Tampa and Miami, that cut across the Everglades in the 1920s, that the Seminoles would kind of reemerge in the consciousness of most Floridians. Of course, there would be trading in Miami and Fort Myers prior to that, but for the most part, the people of Florida paid no attention to the Seminoles, and nor the Seminoles pay attention to the people of Florida. So this is actually a map drawn by the same people who drew the very first map of the U.S., Sidney Morris, along with a guy named Breeze. And we included this map. This is also from 1842. We included this map because it finally shows Dade County in the right place. You can see it down in southeast Florida, right next to Monroe County. But also, you begin to see Florida emerging from those Seminole Wars. More roads, or really paths, coming into Central Florida and going to different destinations in Charlotte Harbor, Caloosahatchee River, of course, in the Tampa Bay area, and then going off to the East Coast to the different forts that were along the Atlantic coast. But then North Florida, you see, has that grid system with the township and range section established, and with even more roads. And 1842 is significant, not only because those last two maps were printed then, but that was the year that the U.S. Congress passed what was called the Armed Occupation Act. And that was, basically the second tactic after declaring the war over with the Seminoles, was creating a method of homesteading to bring white settlers into Florida and to really kind of push, or at least prevent the northern expansion of Seminoles out of the Everglades. And so that Armed Occupation Act stated that if you moved to Florida, stayed here for 5 years, had a homestead, planted crops, and would defend your property against incursions by Seminoles, and actually would arm you with a gun and ammunition, then you get to keep that land for free. And what you got was a quarter of a section, or 160 acres of land. And so, so that homestead was open to whites only, but to men and women, as long as women were the head of a household. And so it was really a great opportunity for people who didn't have either a lot of land or really any land, in the states north of Florida to come into Florida and settle. And it was a way, again, to prevent the Seminoles from retaking any part of Florida that they'd been pushed out of. Also as a way to expand slavery into Florida even more. So last few slides here, last few maps, show the progress that had been made, for lack of a better term, during the territorial era. Actually, the last two maps of Florida are both Florida when it became a state in 1845. So the census of the territory in 1821 showed about 10,000 people living in Florida. But that most certainly was an undercount because it did not include enslaved people or free blacks. It did not include Seminoles or Miccosukes. But so it showed maybe half to a third of the total population of Florida. So 10,000 extrapolate to maybe 20 or 30,000. In 1845, when this map was printed, the census showed almost 67,000 people living in Florida. But that too was an undercount. One, they didn't take a census, or at least they weren't able to tabulate a census for Dade County and St. Lucie County. So not a lot of people, but they did miss the people that they would have counted normally in Dade and St. Lucie. They didn't get them. There were about 25 counties in Florida when it became a state in 1845. But also it doesn't include those Seminoles and Miccosukes, and it almost certainly undercounted the free black population, but it did include all the enslaved people in Florida. And what this map shows is what that state looked like for those 70,000 or so people. You can see the progress that they'd made with the township range and section plan, going all the way down to Charlotte Harbor along the coast, going across kind of our I-4 corridor almost to Cape Canaveral, and all around the Tampa Bay area. And then, of course, going the further north you go, the more complete it is. And so everywhere you see a little square doesn't mean they've got it down to the actual section level. Sometimes it's just the main blocks of townships and ranges. There are 36 sections, I should say, within each township and range block. So it's a lot of land incorporated in these squares. But you at least get a sense that they're getting a sense of Florida, and they're able to start that homesteading process. And that was really critical after the passage of the Armed Occupation Act, getting people that they wanted to have in Florida, basically kind of white farmers, moving in to Florida and taking advantage of this new survey system. And this again shows the kind of that progress in a different way, showing Florida as a state, but again separated into those counties. And this does a pretty good job too of showing the size of Hillsborough. But Hernando County, which in this case briefly was known as Benton County, has already been cut away. So you get a sense again of how big Hillsborough County was at the time. And again, you also get a sense of what the important cities were. St. Augustine, by 1845, even though it had been the capital of Florida since 1565, was really not important anymore. It had been passed by. There was really nothing going for it once it ceased being a capital city. So you have here the two principal cities of Florida at statehood, and that's Tallahassee, of course, the state capital, and still Pensacola. I would say that again, they missed out on Key West. Key West was a very important city, but it's always been its own little outlier. It wouldn't be until many, many years later that Tampa, for example, would attain any kind of real importance. And it really wouldn't be for another 120 years or so that the power shift would change from North Florida to South Florida. And you can see here the tiny little smaller counties in North Florida, the larger counties going south. Even though the population density flipped after World War II from north to south, you still saw a lot of power in North Florida. Florida still took a long time to grow. It's even interesting to think that there was a way to take the railroad from New York to San Francisco before you could take a railroad car from New York to Tampa. So the Intercontinental Railroad connected the country in 1869. The railroad didn't come here until 1883. So even though we would become a state, there was still a tremendous amount of growth to occur. Again, speaking of growth, this is the U.S. in 1845 when Florida had become a state. Other states had been created during that time as well. Missouri, Iowa, Michigan, a few others. Texas would become a state the following year, I believe. But there's still a lot of growing for the U.S. to do by the time Florida became a state. So with that, I thank you all for coming here and listening, and be happy to answer any questions that we have. I know we have folks here that can ask questions, but I didn't mention this before, but I will while we answer some of the audience questions in person, that if you are watching this live at home or wherever you happen to be, you can use the chat function of, I guess, Facebook or Zoom to ask questions as well. So please, if you have questions at home, start typing away, and we'll address questions in person first.
Yes, I used to work for Hillsborough County, and I remember hearing that Hillsborough County was formed during the territory period, but it was named after Wills Hill, who was a British lord in the 1760s. I never got that. What's the background on that?
So Hillsborough County was created in 1834 during the territorial era, but the other geographic names in the area had been established when Florida was a British territory, and so actually a British colony. From 1763 to 1783, those two halves of Florida, East Florida and West Florida, were actually British colonies. We stayed loyal, say we, the Floridian, we stayed loyal during the American Revolution, and so after the end of the Revolution, the Floridas reverted back to Spain. But it was during that 20-year time period that a lot of things were named or renamed by the English. And so you have Egmont Key being named at that point. You've got Hillsborough Inlet on the East Coast being named. And of course, you have Hillsborough Bay, which is right outside the History Center's doors, and the Hillsborough River, all named for Wills Hill, who was the Secretary of State for the British colonies during the time that Florida was a British or was two British colonies. And it was a way basically for map makers and others to curry favor with those above. And so when it came time to name this new county, the largest geographical feature, other than Tampa Bay, was the Hillsborough River and Hillsborough Bay. And the town was already called Tampa. The town of Tampa had already existed, so they probably didn't want to call it Tampa County. So they then went to Hillsborough County. Yeah. Yeah, Lord Hillsborough did a lot of things that upset the colonists, and the Stamp Act was certainly one of them. Benjamin Franklin actually got a meeting in Ireland with Lord Hillsborough. He had to wait several days to get that meeting. When he finally did get the meeting, this is prior to the actual shooting part of the American Revolution. After Franklin got this meeting, he actually traveled back to Philadelphia, came home, and said, "We may as well go to war, because they're not listening to us." And that was Hillsborough, who basically wouldn't listen. Yes. Oh, hang on one second. We'll get a microphone. Oh, okay.
Would you please tell us a little bit about the local maps in the Touchton Map Library's collection?
Okay, so the question is local maps, and I assume local meaning local to Tampa, or local to the Tampa Bay area. So there are, 5,000 or 6,000 maps in the collection in total, and a lot of them are more broad Florida maps, or even maps of the Caribbean and maps of the southeastern United States. But we do have a lot of city maps, a lot of town maps, a lot of county maps. And then we kind of break it down further. There are, we have plat maps that show neighborhoods. We have subdivision maps. There's a lot of growth in the 1920s, actually. In probably 2024, we're going to do a Florida land boom exhibit, looking back at the 1920s land boom. And there were a tremendous number of maps that were created during that time period throughout, not just for the Tampa area, but throughout Florida. And so we have a lot of maps that are these neighborhood maps that people can utilize for research, whether it's a community research or soil preservation or whatever the case might be. The map library is a great resource for that kind of in-depth research. All right, microphone's coming your way.
So first of all, that was a great question about how Hillsborough got named Hillsborough. I've always wondered that. Always talked to these guys like, what the hell, But anyway, But can you go back like 3
Sure.
maps, please? That one. Oops, sorry, that one.
Yep.
So the area of what's now Hillsborough County, like around Odessa, and it's just a big empty blank square,
Yes.
and it's surrounded by the townships. What is that big empty square?
It's
Wait a minute,
some.
you don't know this off the
Yeah,
top of your
I
head?
don't. I should. It is. There was a large land grant that I think was still under dispute at that time.
Oh,
So I think that's what that is. It actually has writing across it, but I can't unfortunately read that close. That's a great question. I like being stumped, and you definitely just stumped me there. But it's somebody's. I think it says survey, but I don't know. Okay. So you know the answer. You set me up.
No, I don't know if he set you up or not, but
I'm kidding.
but up in that area, if you pull old legal descriptions,
Mhm.
it will actually say part of the land grant of Lord Hillsborough, blah blah blah
Okay.
blah blah. Some of
Well,
the
Hillsborough never had a land grant,
Well,
but it might
not
be
something- but
is it
something
Arredondo
weird
maybe? I
like
forget
that.
there's the Arredondo grant, and there's a few other
yeah, because
grants.
that's the other one up there.
Yeah.
That's the only part that if you have a piece of property in there, does it have a section, township, and range?
Okay. Even to this day.
So if you own property in Arredondo,
Yeah.
it does not say section this, township this, range
Gotcha.
this.
Really? So there you go.
Well, no, that's what I'm asking.
Oh no, no. They've gone back again, unless you all know otherwise. As far as I know, even these kind of quirky little things, they've gone back to
And wiped it all
create.
clean.
Yeah, because
Okay.
again, you all know from seeing surveys, they used to do from the old oak tree by the river and down to the big rock and that stuff. You can
Six
never get
chains
anything.
and all that. yeah.
Exactly. Oh yeah, they would use chains, and so the certain number of chains equal a certain length, but the chains would expand and contract depending on the heat and cold. So the length of these surveys, although again, that aside, people who've gone back and found some of the old survey marks, they're incredibly accurate. What they were able to do with chains is just astounding. But yeah, no, I'm almost positive that they now have more proper land descriptions, land use, or not land use, but land legal descriptions for these properties.
What we can do is I'll find that legal description and if it's okay, I'll send it to you.
Oh, I'd love to see that.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Oh, do you have a question, sir?
Just briefly, whatever happened to Richard Hackley? Did he
Oh, so Hackley.
find a castle somewhere?
So you got to
and stake his
exactly got to
claim, or-
finish what happened to Mr. Hackley. So Hackley, his brother owned half of Key West, and so he was able to keep that. But Hackley was a lawyer in New York, so he had a lot of money. He did fine, but he did not get to keep that land. He was turned down by the Supreme Court the first time in 1842, which is where the Hackley map was prepared as evidence, but never used as evidence. But then his heirs on a different track kept pursuing it again until 1904, so well after he died. But he did fine. Don't cry for Mr. Hackley. Exactly.
I actually have a couple questions. First, can you recommend any, say, historical literature about the experience of surveying back in the wilderness days?
There's a man who's retired now, but he worked for the his name is Joe Knetsch, Knetsch, and he worked for the state, maybe Department of Environmental Protection, or one department up in Tallahassee, and he has done more research on surveyors and surveying of Florida than anybody. So if
Right.
you look up Joe Knetsch, Knetsch,
Right.
both journal articles and independent publications, he has done tons of research on it and really talking about the life of surveyors during this time. And it was really, really hard.
Yeah.
So I think he's been published in the Florida Historical Quarterly. I think there's a story in Tampa Bay History or Sunland Tribune. He's also written books all about the history of surveying in Florida.
Right.
It's a tremendous resource, and it's really fascinating to see what they had to go through because it was dangerous. One, the native people knew what they were doing and did not want them doing it. There were all kinds of animals, bears and panthers and things, and it was just hot and miserable.
Yes.
So it was very difficult
It's
work.
still that way.
Yeah, exactly. That part hasn't changed.
And the second question is, what kind of paper were the old maps printed on? How well has it held up over the years?
So generally speaking, the older the map, the better quality of the paper, and so the better condition of it, assuming other things are okay. So by the middle of the 19th century, they began printing on pulp paper, which is really acidic and really not very good. Also, a lot of these government documents, which are where a lot of these maps came from, are very, very thin paper. So not only is the quality bad, they're also just fragile by their thickness. But you go back to linen maps, linen back maps, they're in great shape. The Circe map, which I'll go back to, which is the wall map, of which there are unfortunately very few, this particular copy had been lacquered over. And so as a way at the time to try and preserve it, but unfortunately damaged it. And so this actually is the map after the lacquer had been removed by a conservator, which increases the longevity of the map, but it left this kind of staining across. You can bleach things, you can bleach paper, but we don't like doing that because there's no point in making it brighter because you're going to kind of lighten everything. But generally speaking, the older the item, the better quality paper.
Rodney, as a Louisianian, I didn't hear it, I might have missed it. When did they take out the Florida parishes? What year did they and give Mississippi theirs and Alabama theirs?
Yeah, so thanks, Jack. So the question's about the Florida parishes. There are actually these Florida parishes in southern Louisiana, and that dates back to when the time between Florida being a British colony and then the second Spanish period. So Spain acquired what we know as Louisiana after the American Revolution. And so Florida went all the way to the Mississippi River. Debate about whether New Orleans was part of it or not, but it certainly went to the eastern bank of the Mississippi. And so when there was an acquisition of land by the federal government that, actually, I guess that was Louisiana Purchase, there was debate about how much of that was still owned by Spain and how much of it was French, because the French had reacquired it from Spain. But the Spanish disputed whether or not the Gulf Coast, northern Gulf Coast, was part of what they turned back over to France. So that's why they said this is still part of Florida. But the U.S. said, well, no, we like what France is saying because we get more property on the Gulf. And so it was included in the Louisiana Purchase. So that's why it's still part, but it was part of Florida, but not during not our territorial era. It was during the second Spanish period.
Aside from Hackley, were the old Spanish land grants honored when Florida became a U.S. territory?
So yes, the Spanish land grants that predated 1818, and there's a certain month in 1818 that they had to have been granted by and completed by. But yes, there were a lot of land grants, and there were Spanish people who retained their property in American Florida, particularly in the St. Augustine and Pensacola areas. But there were other land grants, as was the case with the English when they gave Florida or had to give Florida back to Spain following the American Revolution. There were English people who were able to retain land in Spanish Florida. And so as Florida changed hands, people weren't necessarily forced to sell. The first time when the British took Florida from Spain, everybody in Spain had to relinquish their land. But after that, as Florida changed hands, people could retain their land. And that definitely was the case with these Spanish land grants that were legal land grants prior to 1818. And again, mostly around St. Augustine and Pensacola. So those Spaniards did get to keep their land. Not very many of them, but there were. There any other? Yes, sir. If you hang on 1 second,
Just out of curiosity, some of the old maps have Mosquito County.
Oh, yes.
And whatever happened to Mosquito County?
I'm so happy you brought that up because I forgot to mention.
Because I'd like to join the Mosquito County Chamber of Commerce.
Well, that's the thing. So, again, these maps are kind of hard to see on the big screen. Those at home can see them. And again, you can always go to the History Center's website and see them. This is a good one that shows, actually, this map shows a few counties that don't exist anymore. So Mosquito County. Mosquito County was a tremendous amount of area in central Florida that's Orange, Seminole, Osceola, Brevard, going all the way to the Atlantic coast. But it was aptly named Mosquito County, not just because of mosquitoes, but Mosquito Inlet, which is a pretty old place name, is where Mosquito County got its name. But you mentioned the Chamber of Commerce. You're exactly right. When it comes time to get people to move to your area, you're not going to really get very far by saying, come to Mosquito County. And so oranges, which are not native to Florida, but have grown wild in Florida since the early Spanish explorations of the 1500s, were growing wild there. And so they named it Orange County because it's a much more pleasant sounding name than Mosquito County. This map also shows, it's hard to read in there, but if you can see kind of across the middle part of Florida, there's a Lee Reed County, Leigh-Read. Lee Reed was a person in the territorial legislature, and in 1841, he was killed in a duel in Tallahassee. The man who killed him was the brother of a guy that Lee Reed killed in a duel the year prior. And so people liked Lee Reed, except for the brother of the guy who killed him. And so they actually wanted to create a county. And actually, that's what Mosquito County was briefly, was Lee Reed County. But it never was officially named that because Richard Kite-Powell, who was the territorial governor, either didn't like Reed enough or just forgot to file the paperwork or sign the paperwork or whatever it was. And so that was never officially filed to change the name of Mosquito to Lee Reed. So it remained Mosquito until it became Orange County. And again, I'd mentioned earlier, and it's on this map. I'm sorry, I keep kind of going back and forth. On this map, there kind of one more name change is Benton County. Hernando was originally called Hernando County, but then this guy Benton, who was in the U.S. Congress, was one of the people in favor of creating Hernando County, and so Thomas Hart Benton. And so the people of Hernando, in honor of him, wanted to do something for him, so they just went ahead and renamed their county in his honor. But he was a big proponent of the Missouri Compromise, which was limited the expansion of slavery. So the people of Hernando said, forget you, we're going to be Hernando County again. And so there was only a brief period of time where Hernando was called Benton County.
You mentioned that originally Pasco was Dade County.
Well, they called it that. Yeah, it wasn't.
Is that around the same time that Dade City was named?
So Dade City was named around the same time as Dade County was created, yes. So Dade City was named in honor of Major Dade as well, of course, much closer to the site of the Dade battle. But then when the idea was floated of creating a county in honor of Dade's name, that's when these map makers began putting it on what is now Hernando, Pasco, that area on the West Coast. But it never was officially there. They just put it in the wrong place. But yes, Dade County, Dade City created on the same time. Any more questions? Fantastic. Well, once again, let me thank you all so much for attending in person, those who are attending at home, both live and seeing this later. Please go to the History Center's website, tampabayhistorycenter.org, and learn about all of our other programs, other offerings that we have for you. And with that, I wish you all a good night.